and welcome to this a bit different video on my channel where we will be taking a look at a dashboard I built and then we look at the process of how to get there. This is our target dashboard. It gives us information about movies that we can watch while flying in a plane to better help us make the right selections of the movies we would like to watch. Now, what's the data source of it? We will get into that, how the data was prepared and how this report was built. But let me give you a quick guide through this report first. So we start off with a bit of a KPI page giving us some key facts. So we have 323 movies, for example. We see the distribution of the runtime. We can see how they are rated. We can look at movies by year, how many there were that are available were released in each year. So we can see we have a very recent bias when it comes to the movies, and we only have a very small handful of movies that are old that have been made available to us to watch. And we can also take a look at different genre mixtures of what we could watch during our trip. Of course, we have some more detailed pages like a movies by year page, which kind of shows us the relation. So we can already see that over half of the movies that are available to us have been released in the last 3 years. And of course, we can also go in and search for specific movies if we want to watch them. For example, I want to watch Dune Part 2. And I can find it here. It's available within my data set. And then to go deeper, we can either double click here, or we can go to the movie details page, which are linked together. And what this page does is it shows us the title of the movie. It gives us 4 key facts. And if there is a trailer available, we can play it right from within SAS Visual Analytics. So let's take a look at this. If we double click Dune, we get moved into this page with our actual data of the movie we clicked. So we can see Dune Part 2 was released in 2024. There's a runtime of 166 minutes. The genre was classified as action, and we get a plot summary, and then we can hit play and watch the movie and even go to full screen if we want to. Now, let's go back, and because there's one final page where I use the text topics object to quickly categorize and understand kind of what's going on based on the plot summaries we have for the movies. So that is all the data that we have gathered. Now let's look at where this data came from. So for that, I'm gonna switch over to the Lufthansa website where you can find all the movies that are currently available on their flights. And you can see it's a list, and you would need to keep clicking to see additional movies. Now, this is fine to browse on your own, but it has some limitations into actually looking at all of them in a more structured way. So, poking around, I found there is an API endpoint for it. So let us switch over to SAS Studio, where we can take a look at that. Note that all the code that you see on screen right now will be available through the link in the description, so you can take a look at your own pleasure. So here we are inside of SAS Visual Analytics, and we are starting things off by retrieving the data from the Lufthansa API and ingesting it into SAS. So I'm just using proc HTTP here and putting the output into a temporary file name and then assigning a JSON library on top of it, which you can see in line 28. And then I join the resulting data using proc SQL. And if we take a look at the library that was assigned on the raw output, it looks something like this. And then if we looked at the joined table, if I open this up, we can see we have an ID column. We get the title, the year, the runtime. We get an image URL, which is to kind of like a highlight poster image. And then we get a URL for a trailer. So note, There isn't a trailer for every single movie available, but for a majority of them at least there is one. So this is very sparse data. We only have an ID, but this is an ID assigned by Lufthansa. It doesn't really help us in any way. We have a title, the year it was released, the runtime, the rating, and then the image and video URL. Now I want some additional data that I can use to understand the genre, get the plot summary, get maybe like the box office rating and things like ratings that have been made available on the internet. For that, I'm using the Open Movie Database API, which you can sign up for using their website, which will also be linked down in the description. And then in here, you can easily go in and just query by title, by year. You can have a plot summary and you can select how you want your response, and then you get it back. So for that, I have created a variable that you need to assign on your own, which is called Open Movie Database API key. So just put in your value in its place so you can get up and running. And for that, I'm looking at a secondary program where I have created a macro that all it needs as an input is the ID that we got from Lufthansa. This will be our key to joining the two data sets. A title, so what is the title of the movie and when it was released. Note I set the plot to full. I want the full text, not the short version of it. You can do this as you see fit. Let's take a quick look at it. Basically, same structure. We have a proc HTTP call against the API endpoint, and then I destructure the API response into a table, parse the dates, parse currency values that we get back, all these things. So let's minimize this macro and take a look at how it's called. I clean up the names of the movies because sometimes if it's a foreign language movie title, it contains the English movie title in brackets in the response we got from Lufthansa. And I want to remove that because otherwise it won't work with the Open Movie Database API endpoint. Do some other general cleanup, and then I call the macro we saw beforehand for each movie once, and then I rejoin all the information back into one table that I can then promote up to the SAS engine to make use of it in SAS Visual Analytics. And let's look at the general output that we got. So you can see I have the title in here, the release year. You can also see I have some missing data where just the Open Movie Database API endpoint, the requested title it wants, and the one provided to us by Lufthansa doesn't match. But in general, they match. So for most movies, we get great data. We get additional columns like the release date. So before we only had the year, now we also get a date. We get the runtime again. We get 3 genres back. We also get things like the director, the writer, and the actors. And then the plot, the movie language, the country or countries, and also if it won any awards. We again get a title image that we can display, and then we get scores from Metascore. We get the IMDb rating and how many IMDb votes a title has. And then finally the ID if we would want to look the movie up inside of IMDb or provide a link into IMDb directly. All of that data is then joined and made available in SAS, so we can work with it in SAS Visual Analytics. So let's take a look at the report again, now that we have our data. We'll go to our in-flight movies again, and let's go into the editing mode of our report. So, as I said, we have our data in here, we have all the different columns we have made available through our data gathering process, and then we just build up our report. I mean, most of the introductory pages are very common visualizations, and what I want to focus on is this movie details page where you could even view the trailer of the movie. So let's first look at this all movies page. This page has, as we saw before, you have some control object at the top where we can search for movies or look through different genres to filter down the data. And then we can double click any movie in here. And this then takes us to this movie details page with the specific information. This is done by, on the table object, on the right-hand side, I go to the actions pane. And under page links, I have linked it to the movie details page. This just enables us to dive into more details, and this specific row that I've clicked will be passed as a filter to that page. So it's always sub-filtered, and we can actually see that when we double click on a page. You can see the filter icon up top on here, and if I click it, you then see the title, the release year, and the rating, which is the information we had in that detailed page, was passed along to us to this new page, which we then use to select the data in there. So great way to make things more interactive. And now let's look at this movie details page. Now, you might, of course, note that this page isn't a common SAS visual analytics object. And that is true in part. This is what's called a data-driven content object. You can find it in the objects pane on the left-hand side. If you search for data-driven, it's in the content category, and assign it to your report, like you would any other object. So let's pull in a new object. And here you can see if we start adding variables, let's just add a list of actors in here. It will display it as a table. And the idea of this object is that you can bring your own visualizations, own pages, and make it interactive with data that comes from your report. This still honors all the authentication and authorization of the user currently viewing the report. So things like row level security still apply, of course. So this is the general idea of this object. And then this default view that we have in here is driven by the options on the right-hand side on the object. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's web content and there is a URL in here. This is just this default table that comes pre-selected for you when you add a data-driven content object. But if we go back to going back to our movie details page, looking at the URL of this object, you can see that it's an HTML page, that it's hosted on some generic web server. Doesn't really matter. There is some configuration options of which web server SAS can integrate. So you have an allow list in there, so you can't just pull in content from everywhere and pass data between it. So your administrator has to configure that, but that's a simple step. And on this web server, I have an HTML page that can receive data from your visual analytics report and then change its behavior, its display based on that data. So let's take a step back and take a look at that website that is hosted here. For this, I'm going to switch to VS Code, where I've written an HTML page that we can make use of. So in here, you see the baseline structure within HTML. So let me zoom in a tiny bit and actually close this pane. So there we go, where we can see the kind of general structure of the web page we saw in Visual Analytics. So we have this info section, which contains the title, release year, plot, etc. And then the trailer section, where the actual movie trailer will be displayed, or the video will be displayed. This is all left empty by default, as you can see here. It's just a span with an ID. There's nothing in those spans, and there's also no source to our iframe. So by default, it's empty. Now, what we do is we add an event listener through JavaScript that listens for data to be passed from SAS Visual Analytics into our website here. And then we can destructure that message, destructure that data, and start working with it. We are going to call this onMessage. Here we're going to look for 6 columns that we need to display the title, release year, plot, genre, the trailer, and I missed something, that is the runtime. Exactly. So 6 items that we need. If we don't get 6 here, we are going to send a no data message, and that's going to look like we will have an error message in our object that it wasn't configured properly. That is something the report user has to do. And we can also display a message inside of Visual Analytics. But let's assume the user passes in the data correctly. Then we are going to destructure the result, pass it into an object called example movie. And then we are going to put this into a function called fillMovieInfo. This function simply adds the result to the display of the HTML page, meaning we are going to retrieve all our elements, and then we are going to set the content of that HTML element and just keep adding the title, the release year, etc. to it. And this is then pushed onto our web server, through which we can integrate it into our VA report and make it available and use it inside of our VA report. Now, this is of course more of a playful integration to showcase what's possible in here. But if you are building more serious applications through data-driven content, one thing you can do to make them easier to reuse in other places is go to the specific object that you have and save to objects pane. This will then add this specific configuration with the URL and all of that into the standard objects pane of SAS Visual Analytics, making it much easier to reuse over and over again in different reports all over the place and by different departments, for example. So that's a great use case, how you can expand the visualization or information display capabilities of SAS Visual Analytics. Now, the question which movies I will watch in my flight, I can't really answer. I don't know yet. But it nonetheless was a fun exploration of what's possible integrating SAS with external data and displaying it in a fun and interactive way directly in SAS Visual Analytics. As I said before, all the data, code, information to replicate what I've just shown is available down in the description below. Have fun with it, and if you do, send me a message. Bye bye.